In the dense fog-drenched hills of Tennessee, where the mountains seemed to touch the sky and the trees whispered old secrets, the Campbell family had lived for generations. The land was wild and untamed, but to the Campbells, it was home, an inheritance passed down through the years like a treasure no one could steal. Their father, a quiet but unyielding man, had taught them that the mountains took care of those who respected them, but also punished those who dared to cross their code. It was a code older than the law, older than any man-made rule, a code born from survival, from a life carved into the land, where moonshine wasn't just a business, it was a lifeline. Wade Campbell, the father, had raised his 3 sons with a firm hand and a stern heart. His oldest, John, was a man of few words but many actions, his strength earned through years of working the still. Daniel, the middle son, was quieter, more introspective, yet just as capable with the iron-wrought tools of their trade. And then there was Luke, the youngest, who had learned quickly from his brothers, but still carried the rawness of youth in his eyes, a fire that hadn't yet been tempered by age. Wade often told his sons, "You protect what's yours in these mountains. No one else will, not the law, not the government, and certainly not anyone looking to take what's yours for themselves." The lesson was simple but profound. In the heart of these hills, survival meant understanding the rhythms of nature and the ways of the people who called it home. The Campbells weren't just moonshiners, they were part of the land itself. Their family's recipe, a closely guarded secret, had been passed down through the generations. It was a blend of corn, sugar, and water. But the true magic lay in the secret ingredient, the hickory bark smoked at the perfect temperature. That recipe had been in the Campbell family for 50 years, a legacy that carried as much weight as any fortune, even if the world beyond the mountains would never understand it. Their father's stern face often appeared in their minds, especially on mornings when the fog rolled down the mountainside like a blanket, hiding everything in its path. Wade's voice echoed in their ears. "No man takes what's yours and walks away from it, not in these mountains." But the world outside the mountains was changing. The government's revenuers, tasked with enforcing prohibition, were beginning to creep into the rural valleys and hollows, setting their sights on the Campbells' operation. The moonshine business was in danger, and with it, the family's way of life. The mountain code was now at risk of being violated, and the brothers knew what that meant. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky as the Campbell brothers worked under the dim light of a lantern, their hands steady as they transferred freshly brewed moonshine from the copper stills into jars. The process was laborious but familiar. Each movement was part of a long-standing ritual, a dance that had been perfected over generations. John, the eldest, worked with the precision of a man who had spent his entire life mastering the craft. He knew each step of the process, how to check the mash, the right temperature for the distillation, and when to start collecting the final product. His hands moved as if they were guided by the wisdom of his father, who had taught him every step, every secret of the trade. Daniel, the middle brother, often watched John, but he was always thinking 2 steps ahead. He'd inherited his father's quick wit and patience, and he understood the importance of keeping their operations a secret. Every jar they filled was a precious commodity, and each drop was worth more than gold to the people who lived in the mountains. Luke, the youngest, was still learning the ropes. His face was a bit softer, his hands not yet as weathered as his brother's, but he had the heart of a Campbell. He was quick to pick up on the details, how the still needed to be monitored constantly, how the fire had to be just right, and how their father's old tools had to be handled with respect. But tonight there was something different in the air. The brothers could feel it. The revenuers had been making their rounds through the neighboring valleys. Rumors had begun to spread about their presence. It was only a matter of time before the law found its way to their doorstep. Wade had always said the government would eventually come for them. It was only a question of when. "I'll bet my life that they're already sniffing around Pine Hollow," John muttered, his voice low and guarded. He was the first to speak as they worked in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. "I've heard the same," Daniel replied, not looking up from his work. He carefully tightened the lid of a jar and set it aside, his brow furrowed with concern. "They'll come for the still first, but we can't let them take it. We're too far in, too deep to back out now." Luke, who had been silent, finally spoke, his voice filled with an edge of nervousness. "What if they bring too many?" he asked, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that only a young man, still new to the brutal realities of life, could feel. "We don't let them take a thing," John replied sharply, his voice unwavering. "We don't run, not from anyone, not from the law." The brothers shared a quiet look, each of them understanding the weight of what John was saying. There would be no turning back if the revenuers arrived. No apology, no retreat. This was about more than just moonshine. It was about preserving everything their family had worked for, everything that had kept them alive in the harsh, unforgiving mountains. "We defend this place with everything we've got," Daniel added, his voice steady. "Father would have wanted it that way." They each nodded, their resolve hardening. This wasn't just about protecting their moonshine. It was about protecting their legacy. And if the revenuers thought they could waltz into their mountain home and take what was theirs, they were gravely mistaken. Their father's code was clear. You protect what's yours, no matter the cost. It was a crisp October evening when the first sign of trouble came. The brothers had just finished their work in the still and were packing up for the night when they heard the sound of an engine in the distance. A truck, heavy with the weight of its cargo, rattled down the narrow mountain road. The headlights cut through the darkness, and for a moment, all three brothers stopped, watching the approaching vehicle. John was the first to react, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape around them. He motioned for the others to follow him into the shadows of the trees, his hand signaling for silence. The truck came closer, and the rumble of its engine reverberated through the mountain air. "It's them," Daniel whispered, his voice low, but filled with dread. Luke, always eager, but often quick to panic, shifted uneasily. "How do we know it's the revenuers?" John placed a hand on his younger brother's shoulder, steadying him. "The way they drive, they think they're invisible, but they're not." The truck slowed as it approached the makeshift road that led to their family's operation. The brothers crouched behind thick trees, their breath quiet but sharp in the cold night air. A moment later, the truck stopped just beyond the clearing where the still sat hidden. Two men stepped out, both dressed in dark uniforms, their faces obscured by the dim light. They walked slowly toward the still, examining the area with the deliberate care of lawmen trained to find what others sought to hide. One of the men, a tall, thin figure with a grizzled beard, muttered something to his partner. John's hand clenched around the rifle at his side. He had always known this day would come, but the reality of it stung like a bitter wind. The thought that the revenuers were so close, so near to taking everything his family had worked for, burned in his chest. "I'll take the shot," John said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a dangerous edge. "No," Daniel responded, his voice firm. "We don't kill unless we have to. Not yet." They waited in tense silence, the moonlight filtering through the canopy of trees above. The revenuers continued their inspection, walking around the still, checking the woodpile nearby. John's finger hovered near the trigger, but he didn't pull it. His eyes narrowed, his chest heavy with the weight of their decision. As much as the mountain code called for swift retribution, his brother's words echoed in his mind. "Don't kill unless you must." Suddenly the silence was broken by a loud crack, an unexpected noise from behind them. One of the revenuers spun around, his hand reaching for his pistol. "Get down!" John hissed. In a heartbeat, the brothers dove into the underbrush, moving swiftly and quietly. They held their breath as the revenuers scanned the area, their eyes darting in every direction. But the brothers were hidden, unseen in the shadows. The two lawmen muttered among themselves, clearly growing frustrated before turning and heading back to their truck. One of them, the bearded man, muttered something about not enough evidence before getting back in the vehicle. John exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. "This isn't over," he said quietly. The truck rumbled off into the distance, and the brothers emerged from the trees, their eyes still on the road where the revenuers had vanished. John wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands shaking slightly. He had almost taken the shot, almost sent the whole operation into chaos. But he had held back, remembering his father's words about mountain justice, about not becoming what you hated. "That was too close," Luke said, his voice tight with the kind of fear that only comes with being a part of something dangerous. "What do we do now?" John didn't answer right away. His mind raced, calculating the risk, weighing the consequences of their next move. They couldn't let the revenuers get too comfortable. They couldn't allow them to return with more men, more firepower. The brothers had always kept a low profile, working in secret, but now it felt like the walls were closing in. The law was too close to their doorstep. "We need to move the still," Daniel suggested, his voice calm and measured. "We can't risk them finding it again." John shook his head. "They'll keep coming. They won't stop until they take what's ours." Daniel looked at him, concern clouding his features. "Then we'll fight." John met his brother's gaze, his eyes hard. "We don't have a choice anymore. They came here. They're going to come again. And next time they'll bring more." Luke shifted uneasily, his fingers tapping nervously against his side. "And if they bring more? What do we do then?" "We take them out," John replied, his voice colder than the night air around them. "We show them what happens when they come into our territory." Daniel's expression hardened. The youngest brother, Luke, still had doubts. But the middle brother had seen the cost of inaction. He knew what was at stake, their way of life, their family's future. It was all on the line. "We'll do it like Father would have," Daniel said softly, his voice full of a quiet but resolute fury. "We'll protect what's ours, no matter the cost." Luke glanced between his brothers. He had never imagined things would come to this. The thought of violence, of killing, made his stomach churn, but he could see the determination in their eyes. This wasn't about moonshine anymore. This was about survival. "All right," Luke said finally, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Let's do it." The brothers stood together, a silent oath passing between them. They would no longer wait for the law to make its move. They would take the fight to the revenuers. The mountain code demanded it, and they would follow it to the bitter end. "Tomorrow," John said, his voice low and steady, "we end this." As the brothers looked out into the darkening woods, the weight of their decision pressed down on them. The road ahead would be. The morning fog clung to the ground like a ghost, weaving through the trees and settling in the hollows, where the Campbell brothers had made their home. It was a stillness in the air, the kind of silence that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. They had been up before dawn, preparing for what was to come. John, Daniel, and Luke stood together in the dim light, their eyes focused, determined. This wasn't just about moonshine anymore. It was about survival. "We've got to move fast," John said, his voice low but steady. "They won't expect us to come for them this soon." Luke, still unsettled by the violence they had already seen, glanced at his brothers. "What if they have more men with them this time?" "They will," Daniel replied, "but we know this land better than they do, and we don't give up what's ours, not to anyone." The brothers gathered their gear in silence, rifles, ammunition, and provisions for the day. They had a plan, a simple plan. They would track the revenuers down, one by one, just like predators in the wild. The woods were their home, and they knew every trail, every rock, every hollow. The revenuers were the outsiders, unfamiliar with the land. It gave the Campbells an advantage. John took the lead, his steps quiet as he moved through the forest. Daniel followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. Luke, though hesitant, stayed close, his hand gripping the rifle he had just recently grown accustomed to. He had never imagined that one day he would be hunting men, but as they moved deeper into the mountain, he knew there was no turning back. The first sign of the revenuers came by midday. The brothers spotted a campfire in a small clearing, the faint glow visible through the trees. They crouched down, watching the group of 4 men gathered around the fire, their voices muffled by the distance. The brothers knew they had to be careful. They couldn't make a direct assault just yet. "We wait until dark," John said softly, his eyes locked on the camp. "We don't give them the chance to see us first." The brothers settled into the brush, their muscles tensed with anticipation. As the day wore on, the sunlight began to fade, and the shadows grew longer. Time slowed as they waited. The only sounds, the rustling of the leaves, and the occasional call of a bird. Luke's nerves were on edge, but Daniel's calm presence gave him strength. As the last light of day disappeared, John motioned for them to move. The brothers crept forward, moving in a line. Their footsteps were silent, against the soft earth. John's eyes stayed locked on the campfire, watching as the revenuers settled in for the night, unaware of the danger closing in on them. Suddenly, a twig snapped under Luke's foot, the sound echoing through the trees. The closest revenuer, a tall man with a weathered face, whipped his head around, his hand instinctively going for his gun. But before he could draw, John fired. The shot was quick, clean. The man crumpled to the ground, his body falling with a heavy thud. The brothers didn't hesitate. They moved as one, swift and efficient. One by one, the remaining revenuers fell, their bodies silently disappearing into the dark earth. The final man, the one who had spoken of their previous encounter, barely had time to react before Daniel's rifle cracked through the silence. The deed was done. John stood over the body of the last revenuer, breathing heavily but calm. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice cold, "but it's a start." The forest was alive with the sounds of the night. Crickets chirped in the distance, and the wind whispered through the trees. But for the Campbell brothers, the silence between them felt heavier than ever. They had moved quickly, decisively, but the weight of what they had just done settled like a stone in their chests. It wasn't just the first kill. It wasn't even about protecting the Moonshine anymore. It was about something deeper. A sense of honor, a need to defend their family and their land from the encroaching law. The brothers had been prepared for violence, but now that it was done, the reality felt different. John, always the first to take charge, was already moving to cover their tracks. "We can't let them find us," he muttered as he wiped his rifle clean, making sure no evidence remained behind. His mind raced, calculating the risk of the rest of the revenuers finding their fallen comrades. Daniel remained still, his eyes scanning the shadows. "How many more do you think are out there?" he asked, his voice low. "4," John answered without hesitation. "But they'll be looking for us now. We have to keep moving." Luke, still rattled by the experience, wiped the sweat from his forehead. He had seen men die before, but never like this, never so coldly. "What happens when we run out of them?" he asked, his voice strained. "We keep going," John replied firmly. "We don't stop until it's done. We protect what's ours, Luke. That's the way of the mountain." The three brothers moved swiftly through the forest, now more determined than ever. They were hunters, yes, but more than that, they were warriors. They had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. The rest of the revenuers wouldn't stop until they had taken everything: the Moonshine, their legacy, their home. But the Campbell brothers would stop them first. As they approached the next clearing, they spotted their targets in the distance. The remaining revenuers were gathered near a makeshift camp, their voices low and casual, clearly unaware that the brothers were closing in. John gave the signal, and they crept forward. Each brother knew his role. Each movement was instinctual. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of what was to come. The final confrontation was swift. The revenuers never stood a chance. Their cries for mercy were cut short, drowned out by the sharp crack of rifle fire. As the brothers stood over the bodies of their enemies, the mountain was silent again. This time the silence felt different. It felt like victory. The Campbells had defended their home, their way of life. But in that stillness, there was something else. Something that wouldn't be easily shaken off. They had taken lives, and in doing so they had become a part of the very violence they had fought against. "Let's head home," John said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's over. For now." The brothers made their way back through the woods, the weight of their actions settling in as they disappeared into the night. The mountain, always so quiet and imposing, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter in the Campbell brothers' story. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a cold silver light over the mountains as the Campbell brothers moved silently through the trees. The night felt heavier now, weighed down by the blood they had spilled and the lives they had taken. John, Daniel, and Luke had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the weight of that decision pressed on them, even as the satisfaction of victory lingered in the air. For the first time in their lives, they had killed men who had come into their world with the intent to take everything they had built. The Campbells had never been strangers to hard work, but this was different. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, and the bodies of the revenuers lay scattered behind them, evidence of the violent retribution the brothers had exacted. "They'll come for us," Daniel muttered, his eyes darting around, his hand never straying too far from the rifle slung over his shoulder. He had been calm through the whole ordeal, but even he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut that told him this wasn't over. The law wasn't finished. It never would be, not until they were all dead or in chains. John, always the leader, kept moving forward, his eyes scanning the landscape ahead. "We don't let them, not this time," he said, his voice low, tinged with the hard resolve that had been bred into him by years of living on the mountain. Luke, still grappling with the violence they had just unleashed, kept his gaze on the ground. His footsteps were heavy, and he felt like the weight of the entire mountain pressed down on him. Killing men who might have had families, who had their own reasons for doing what they did. It didn't feel right, but John had made it clear. This wasn't a game. It was survival. And in these mountains, survival meant protecting everything that mattered. "We take back what's ours," John continued, his words like a mantra. "This land, this moonshine, it's ours, no one else's." Daniel nodded, though his face was grim. He had never been one to show emotion, but even he couldn't ignore the toll it had taken on him. The brothers had done what they had to do, but the cost was clear. Ahead, the silhouettes of the remaining revenuers appeared, their campfire flickering in the distance. The brothers crouched down, staying hidden in the shadows. They didn't speak now, their minds focused on the task ahead. The rest of the revenuers had regrouped just a few miles up the road, likely planning their next move. John motioned for the others to follow. They had done their part, eliminating half of the group, but it wasn't over. Not yet. As they approached the camp, John's heart pounded in his chest. The last confrontation would decide it all. There would be no mercy this time. This was their land, their family's legacy. They would do whatever it took to protect it. The brothers moved swiftly, silently, like ghosts, into the clearing. The clearing was bathed in the pale light of the moon, casting long shadows across the ground. The remaining revenuers were huddled around a campfire, laughing and joking as though they hadn't just been part of a deadly pursuit. The Campbells had caught them off guard. This time they were unprepared. John, Daniel, and Luke were no strangers to ambushes, but they didn't need to use the same tactics that had worked before. The brothers knew the land, and they knew how to move through it without making a sound. As they crept closer, their movements synchronized. There was no doubt in their minds. This would be their final stand. John held up his hand to signal a stop. The brothers crouched low, their eyes focused on the group ahead. The fire crackled, and the voices of the revenuers were louder now, more carefree. They had no idea what was coming. "We take them down one by one," John whispered, his voice calm but filled with purpose. No mistakes. Daniel nodded, gripping his rifle tighter. He could already feel the familiar rush of adrenaline. This wasn't the first time he had hunted men, but something about this felt different. The stakes were higher, the line between right and wrong thinner than it had ever been before. Luke swallowed hard, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had never thought his life would lead him here, hunting men in the mountains, becoming the very thing he had always feared. But his brothers were counting on him. They were a team, and if they were going to finish this, they had to do it together. John's voice broke through the silence. Now. In an instant, they moved. The first revenuer dropped before he even had a chance to react. The brothers worked like a well-oiled machine, moving through the trees and taking down their targets one by one. The shots were swift, precise. No hesitation, no mercy. The remaining revenuers scrambled, their guns drawn, but they were outmatched. John, Daniel, and Luke were relentless, each shot carrying the weight of the decision they had made. This was their land, their way of life, and they would protect it no matter the cost. As the last revenuer fell, the brothers stood in the clearing, their breathing heavy, their hearts still racing. The campfire flickered behind them, casting a light on the destruction they had wrought. The brothers looked at each other, the silence between them louder than the gunfire that had just shattered it. "This is it," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "It's over." John nodded, his face expressionless. But Luke, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, knew what they had done. The killing was over, for now. But the mountain still had its price. The blood of the revenuers stained the earth beneath their feet, and the Campbell brothers would carry that weight with them for the rest of their lives. The mountain air felt colder now, the fog thickening as it wrapped itself around the brothers. The silence after the battle hung heavy, oppressive. The once violent sounds of gunshots and shouting had faded into the night, replaced by the unnerving quiet that always followed a killing. The weight of what they had just done settled deep in their bones. John stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the horizon. His face was hard, like the stone cliffs that surrounded them. There was no satisfaction in his victory, only the grim knowledge that there was no turning back. They had crossed the point of no return. The last of the revenuers lay motionless in the dirt, their blood staining the earth beneath them. The campfire, once crackling with life, was now reduced to smoldering embers. The brothers had wiped out the remaining threat, 4 more men who had come to take everything they held dear. But now that the deed was done, the reality of the situation set in. "This is it then," Daniel said quietly, his voice reflecting the exhaustion that had settled in his chest. "We've killed them all." John didn't answer right away. He couldn't. The fight wasn't over for him yet. Not while the law still loomed on the horizon. They had eliminated the revenuers who had come for their moonshine, but their actions wouldn't go unnoticed. The law would catch wind of this massacre soon enough, and the brothers would have to face the consequences of what they had done. There was no going back. "We don't stop," John said finally, his voice cold and determined. "The law will come, but we're ready for them. We move fast, we keep quiet, and we get back to the cabin. The law can't catch us if we don't let them." Luke, who had been standing at the edge of the camp, finally spoke up, his voice shaking. We've killed them, John. We've killed men. What happens when the law comes? What happens when they come for us? John turned to his youngest brother, his eyes hard but filled with an emotion Luke had never seen before. We do what we've always done, Luke. We protect our family. We protect what's ours. Daniel stepped forward, placing a hand on Luke's shoulder. The mountain's been our home for generations, Luke. This is who we are. Don't lose sight of that now. The law can't take what we've earned. Not without a fight. The brothers stood in the clearing, the weight of their choices hanging over them. They had hunted down the revenuers with the same precision they had used to protect their stills. But now the realization settled in. Their lives were forever changed. There was no going back. As the first rays of dawn began to break over the mountain, the brothers made their way back through the trees. The cool morning mist surrounded them as they disappeared into the shadows of the hills, leaving behind the camp of dead revenuers and the bloody remnants of their final stand. The cabin felt emptier now, quieter, even though the brothers had returned home. It had been their haven, their sanctuary from the world outside. But after the massacre, the place seemed different. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the violence, the bloodshed, and now they stood, silent witnesses to the brothers' dark choices. John stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame as he stared out into the valley. The land stretched out before him, rolling hills and thick forests, but it felt foreign now. The mountain, once so welcoming, now felt like a prison, a place where the brothers would never truly be free. He had always known that living by the mountain code came with a price. His father had taught him that, but now, standing here, with the weight of the killings heavy on his shoulders, he wondered if the price had been too steep. Luke was sitting at the table, his hands gripping the edge, his head bowed in thought. His face was pale, his eyes distant, as though the gravity of what had happened had finally hit him. He had been raised in the shadow of the Campbell family legacy, but this was something different. This wasn't just about Moonshine anymore. This was about murder. "I don't know if I can do this, John," Luke said quietly, his voice cracking. "I don't know if I can live with what we've done." John turned, his gaze softening for a moment. He walked over to his youngest brother, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You didn't have a choice, Luke. None of us did. The law was coming. They were going to take everything we've worked for. You did what you had to." Daniel, who had been cleaning his rifle, looked up from his task. "The mountain doesn't forget, and neither should we. We protected our family, our way of life. What's left for us if we don't?" John nodded in agreement. The fire in his gut, the drive to protect what was theirs, burned stronger than ever. The law would eventually come for them, but until then, the Campbell brothers would keep their land, their family's legacy, and their Moonshine business safe. It was what they had always done. "The law doesn't understand what it means to live in these mountains," John said, his voice steady. "They can't understand the code. The code that says, if you come into our world, you pay the price." Luke looked up at his older brother, the guilt still clouding his eyes. "But we killed them, John. They were just doing their job. How is that justice?" John's face hardened. "That's not justice, Luke. That's mountain justice, and it's the only kind that matters out here." As the brothers sat in silence, the weight of their decisions pressing down on them, they knew they had crossed a line. The mountain had shaped them into men who lived by their own rules, but it had also forged them into something darker. They had become the very thing they had always fought against, the lawless, vengeful protectors of the land. But in the world of the Campbell brothers, that was the only kind of justice that mattered. The mountain's silence was deafening in the aftermath of the massacre. The Campbells sat around the table, the same wooden surface that had borne meals, conversations, and the quiet resilience of their family for generations. But today, the brothers couldn't find the comfort they once had here. They were more prisoners of their actions than the mountain itself, a truth that weighed heavily on their hearts. John stood near the window, his arms crossed, looking out over the vast expanse of forest that stretched to the horizon. The trees had always been their refuge, their sanctuary, but now they felt suffocating. Every time he blinked, he saw the faces of the men they had killed, the revenuers who had come for their moonshine, their livelihood, their family. John knew the law would eventually catch up with them. But even more pressing was the realization that their father's legacy was now stained, forever tainted by bloodshed. "We've done it," Daniel said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but his eyes revealed the turmoil within him. "We've taken out the revenuers. But what does that leave us with? What's left when the law comes?" John didn't turn away from the window. "We survive. We keep the land, our way of life. This mountain is the only thing we've ever had, Daniel, and that's what we protect. But what if the law doesn't stop here? What if they send more men? What if they come for us with everything they've got?" Daniel's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, the weight of their actions bearing down on him. Luke, who had been silently watching his brothers, stood up from the table and walked toward the door. His face was pale, his expression drawn and exhausted. He hadn't spoken much in the days since the massacre, but now his words cut through the thick silence. "We've crossed a line. We're no longer just protecting what's ours. We're killing men to defend a way of life that's slipping away. The law's not going to let us keep hiding forever." John turned to face his younger brother. Luke's eyes were filled with confusion and regret, and it made John's heart ache. He wanted to reassure him, to promise that everything would be okay, but he couldn't. They were beyond that point now. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," Luke said quietly, his voice low. "I don't know if I can keep going, pretending that this is what our father would have wanted, that this is justice." John walked toward Luke, his face hardening with determination. "We don't have a choice, Luke. This is the way it is now. We keep fighting. We keep surviving. We don't let them take everything we've worked for." The brothers stood in silence, the weight of their decisions hanging between them. They had come to this mountain to protect their family and their legacy, but now they were uncertain of what that legacy had become. The blood of the revenuers stained their hands, and it was a stain that would never wash away. "We keep the land," John said finally, his voice firm. "That's what matters. That's what our father would have wanted. We protect what's ours." But even as the words left his lips, John couldn't shake the feeling that they had already lost something precious. The mountain had claimed their souls in ways they never could have anticipated, and there was no telling what they would become in the end. The brothers sat in the dim light of the cabin, the fire flickering in the hearth casting long shadows against the walls. It was colder now, the air thick with uncertainty. They had buried their dead, cleaned their rifles, and stilled their nerves. But the question that hung in the air between them was impossible to ignore. What now? The mountain, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The law was closing in, and the brothers knew it. Their actions would not go unnoticed for long. They had killed, and the cost of that bloodshed would follow them wherever they went. Even in the depths of the forest, they couldn't escape the weight of their choices. John sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly. We don't have much time. The law will come for us, and we can't run forever. Daniel leaned against the wall, his eyes focused on the fire. So what's the plan? Do we leave the mountains? Do we turn ourselves in? John's eyes hardened. No, we don't give up. Not without a fight. We protect our family, our land, to the very end. We keep moving, keep hiding, keep surviving. We can't let them take everything we fought for. Luke, still struggling with the aftermath of their actions, walked over to the window and looked out at the land. But how long can we keep running? How long can we keep hiding in these mountains before they find us? We fight, John repeated, his voice unwavering. That's what we do. Daniel exhaled sharply, the reality of their situation settling in. You're right, John. But what happens when we're out of options? What happens when we've done everything we can and it's not enough? Luke turned away from the window, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. I don't know if I can do it, John. I don't know if I can keep running, keep killing. What happens when we've crossed every line and there's nothing left to protect? John stood up, walking over to Luke and placing a hand on his shoulder. We've already crossed that line, Luke. And now we make sure we don't let it all fall apart. We protect what's ours. We keep the land, we keep our family. That's what matters. The brothers sat in silence for a long while, the crackling fire the only sound in the room. They had fought to protect their way of life, their family's legacy. But in the process, they had lost something they could never get back. John stared into the flames, the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. No matter where they went, no matter what they did, the Campbell brothers would never be the same. The world outside the Campbell cabin was slowly changing, but within those four walls, nothing seemed to move. Time had become a slow, sluggish river, carrying the brothers through each passing day with little more than the weight of their actions to mark its passage. The mountain, once an open expanse full of promise and freedom, now felt like a cage, a place where there was no hiding from what they had become. John sat by the fire, his face lit by the flickering flames. He stared into the embers, watching the sparks dance and vanish. His thoughts were clouded, drifting between the ghosts of the past and the inevitable future that awaited them. The law would come. That much was certain. No amount of hiding or running would change it. Daniel sat across from him, sharpening a knife, his movements slow and methodical. His expression was grim, and every once in a while he would glance up at John, the weight of the unspoken words between them heavy in the air. Luke, still restless, paced near the door, his boots thumping against the wooden floor. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, but no one seemed willing to break it. What are we going to do, John? Luke asked suddenly, his voice tight with frustration. He stopped pacing, his eyes searching his older brother's face for an answer. We can't keep running forever. We've killed men. Killed more than we should have. And now we're just waiting for the law to catch up with us. What happens when they do? John didn't look up. He knew Luke's heart was in turmoil. They had all changed, but it was Luke who had carried the brunt of it. He was the youngest, and this world of blood and survival was never supposed to be his. He had been thrust into it. And now, like the rest of them, he was trapped by the choices they had made. What happens when the law comes? John repeated, finally looking up, his voice hard. We fight, just like we've been doing. This mountain, this life, it's ours. And I'll be damned if we let them take it from us. Not now, not after everything we've done to protect it. Daniel put down the knife, his sharp eyes studying the fire. But how long can we keep it up, John? You said it yourself. The law's coming for us. They won't stop until they've brought us in. We can't outrun them forever. John's jaw tightened. He had thought about that. Thought about it endlessly, but the answer was always the same. He couldn't leave. This was his home. This was their father's land. And he couldn't walk away from it no matter how much the law came knocking. We don't stop, John said finally, his voice low but unyielding. We keep fighting. We keep surviving. This is what it comes down to. We defend our land, and we defend our way of life, no matter what it costs. Luke's eyes flickered with doubt, but he didn't argue. Instead, he walked over to the window, looking out at the darkened expanse of the forest that lay before them. There were no answers to the questions that plagued his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the brothers were running out of time. The storm was coming, and they were standing at its edge. Whether they would be swept away by it or ride it out, no one knew. But as the fire crackled behind them, the only certainty was that the Campbell brothers would face it together, whatever it was. Morning came too quickly. The once peaceful dawn was now a reminder of everything they had done and everything they still had to face. The cold air seeped through the cracks in the cabin, but it wasn't the chill that made the brothers shiver. It was the weight of the approaching reckoning. The law had to be out there somewhere, closing in on them. There were no more hiding places, no more running. The end was coming. John stood outside the cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon. The world around him was still and quiet, but inside his mind raced. Every noise, every movement felt amplified. He could feel the weight of what was coming. The law would find them, and when they did, there would be no escape. Daniel joined him outside, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his face unreadable. He stood by his brother, the silence between them comfortable but heavy. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They had made their decisions, and now they would face the consequences. "Do you think it'll be today?" Daniel asked quietly. John shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the mountainside in the distance. "I don't know, but it's coming. We've crossed the line. The law isn't going to ignore what we've done." Daniel exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the cold air. "Do you regret it? Killing them?" John's jaw tightened. "I regret that it had to come to this. But no, I don't regret what we did. We protected our land, our family. That's what matters. Then what happens when the law comes? Daniel pressed, his voice tight. What happens when it's too much? John turned to face him, his eyes hard and resolute. We stand, we fight. The mountain is ours, and I won't let them take it from us, not without a fight. Luke came out of the cabin, his face pale and tired. The night had been restless for him, filled with nightmares of the faces they had left behind, the men they had killed. He had seen their faces in his dreams, twisted and angry, reaching for him from the darkness. The guilt gnawed at him, but the fear of what was coming was worse. John, Daniel, Luke said, his voice shaky. I don't know if I can do this anymore. I don't know if I can keep running. John cut him off, his voice firm. There's no turning back, Luke. We've made our choice. And now we live with it. The brothers stood together, facing the uncertain future. They had done the unthinkable to protect their family, and now the reckoning had come. They had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The world around them was still, but the storm was coming. And when it hit, the Campbell brothers would face it head-on, together. The morning mist clung to the mountain, a blanket of dampness that made the air feel colder than it was. The cabin had been quiet for hours. The only sounds, the occasional crackle of the fire, and the brothers' steady breathing. The weight of their choices pressed heavily on each of them, their bodies worn from the strain of the past days and the emotional toll of the killings they had enacted. John sat at the table, his rifle resting against the wall beside him. He hadn't slept in what felt like days. The quiet of the cabin seemed endless, the silence only broken by his brother's occasional murmurs. His thoughts were chaotic, a swirl of memories, decisions, and the haunting faces of the men they had killed. The law was closing in, but worse than that was the gnawing feeling that they had become something they had never intended to be. His mind kept drifting back to their father, how he had always spoken of mountain justice, of the way the land and their family's legacy demanded respect. But John couldn't help but wonder if their father had ever imagined it would come to this: murder, bloodshed, and a life on the run. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. He said nothing, just leaned against the frame, watching his older brother with the same quiet determination that had carried them both this far. It's all we've got now, isn't it? Daniel's voice broke the silence, heavy with the burden of their shared reality. This mountain, this life, it's all slipping away, no matter how much we fight to hold on to it. John didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted back to the window, the sun just beginning to break through the fog, casting golden light across the land. For a moment it felt like everything was as it had been, peaceful, untouched by the violence they had brought into it. But he knew that wasn't true. We've crossed too many lines, Daniel. Luke's voice came from the other side of the room. He had been quiet for hours, but now his words rang with an undeniable ache. I can't forget what we've done. It's haunting me. John stood up, his movements slow. He could feel the guilt weighing down on Luke, and he knew that his younger brother was struggling with it in a way that he couldn't. But there was no simple answer to the question they all faced. They had killed to protect what was theirs, but it came at the cost of their souls. We did what we had to do, John said, his voice strained but firm. We didn't have a choice. The law was coming, and they would have taken everything from us. Luke shook his head, his hands shaking. And what happens when it's too much, when it's all blood and no reason? John didn't have an answer to that. All he knew was that they couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything they had done to protect their way of life. The silence that followed was thick, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The brothers stood together, knowing that the storm was coming. The law would be here soon, but they had already crossed the point of no return. The day had finally come. The weight of the past weeks hung over the Campbell brothers like an unspoken truth. They had fought, bled, and killed to protect their land, but now they had nothing left to hold on to but each other. The law was closing in, and their world was about to shatter. John paced in front of the cabin, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared into the distance. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, but the beauty of the evening was lost on him. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the law, on their father's legacy, and on the blood they had spilled to defend it. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice quiet but filled with the weight of the moment. "The law will be here by morning. We need to decide what we're doing." Daniel stood by the door, his arms crossed. His face was hard, the exhaustion in his eyes replaced by a quiet resolve. "We fight. We don't give up. Not now. Not after everything we've done." Luke, sitting on the edge of the table, looked at his brothers. His eyes were heavy, the fear and guilt still evident in the way he carried himself. "What happens when it's over? What happens when we've run out of places to hide? When we've fought as much as we can and it's still not enough?" John stopped pacing and turned to face his younger brother. There was no easy answer to that question, no comforting words to offer. All he could do was speak the truth. They all knew. "We do what we've always done. We survive." The air in the cabin was thick with tension as the brothers absorbed the weight of John's words. They had come a long way from the quiet, peaceful days spent making moonshine in the mountains. Now, they were facing a future filled with uncertainty and fear. The law was coming for them, and they knew it. The question wasn't if, but when. Daniel stepped forward, his voice resolute. "We fight, John. We fight for our land, for our family, and for everything we've ever known." Luke stood up slowly, his eyes focused on his brothers. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't know if I can keep running, keep killing. What happens when we've lost everything?" John placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, his voice low, but filled with the strength of their family's legacy. "We keep going. We fight until we can't anymore. And when the law comes, we face it. Together." The brothers stood there for a moment, the weight of their decisions heavy in the air. They had crossed a line they could never return from. They had chosen a path of violence, of survival, and now they would face the consequences of that choice. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back. As the last rays of sunlight faded behind the mountains, the brothers prepared for the final confrontation. They had done what they had to do. Now, all they could do was wait for the storm to hit. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the mountains that seemed both familiar and foreign to the Campbell brothers. They had spent their entire lives here, the land as much a part of them as their own blood. But tonight, the mountain felt like a stranger. The trees whispered, the winds sighed, But all the brothers could hear was the relentless beat of their own hearts, pounding in their ears as they waited for the storm they knew was coming. The law was close now, closer than it had ever been. John, Daniel, and Luke had done everything they could to prepare. They had moved the still, hidden their weapons, and cleaned the cabin. But the fear of what was inevitable still gripped them. Their actions, killing the revenuers, fighting for their land, had brought them to this moment. No matter how much they tried to deny it, no matter how much they longed for the quiet life they had once known, they were no longer just moonshiners. They were fugitives, hunted men in a world that no longer understood them. John stood at the front of the cabin, his rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the landscape. But the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. He could feel the weight of the past week, the violence they had carried out, and the bloodshed that had stained the land. But even as the dread settled over him, his resolve was unwavering. This was their home, and they would not let it go without a fight. Daniel stood beside him, his face a mask of determination, though his eyes showed the toll the past days had taken on him. He was tired of the constant fear, the constant fighting. He longed for peace, for the life they had known before the revenuers came into their world. But he, too, understood that peace was no longer an option. Luke was quieter now, sitting at the table with his head in his hands, his elbows resting on the rough wood. He had always been the youngest, the one who had looked up to his older brothers with admiration. But now he felt disconnected. The world they had entered, the world they had created, was a far cry from the one he had dreamed of when he was a boy. The violence, the killing, it weighed on him, but there was no going back. His brothers had made their choices, and he had followed them, whether out of loyalty or fear. It no longer mattered. In the distance, they heard the sound of a vehicle, a truck rattling down the rough mountain road. John stiffened, his grip tightening on his rifle. It was them. The law had come for them. "Stay low," John whispered. "No matter what happens, we don't back down. This is it." The brothers took their positions, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, each of them preparing for what was about to unfold. The silence between them was deafening, but it was the silence of men who knew their fate. They had come to this moment not by chance, but by choice. And now they would face the consequences of that choice. The truck pulled up slowly, its headlights cutting through the darkness. John's heart pounded in his chest. The reckoning had arrived. The headlights of the truck cut through the darkness like a blade, illuminating the front of the Campbell cabin. The brothers stood still, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a storm cloud that had finally burst. John could hear the rumble of the engine as it slowed to a stop, but his mind was focused on the immediate future, the future that was about to unfold with brutal finality. The truck door opened, and the heavy boots of the lawmen thudded on the dirt road. John glanced over at Daniel and Luke, his eyes hard, his voice calm but filled with the certainty of what was coming. "Stay sharp," he whispered. "This is our land. This is our last stand." The brothers had been through countless hardships, countless battles, but this felt different. The law had finally arrived, and with it came the truth they had been avoiding. The truth that, no matter how hard they fought, No matter how much they tried to protect their legacy, the consequences of their actions were unavoidable. They had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. The blood they had spilled had marked them, and now the law had come to collect. The footsteps grew closer, and the brothers could hear the murmur of voices, low and tense. There was no turning back now. This was it. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his breath steady but his heart racing. He could feel the weight of the moment in the pit of his stomach. The law was here, and the choices they had made had led them to this point. But there was no fear in his eyes, only the hard resolve that had always defined him. They had fought for what was theirs. They had done what they had to do. A figure stepped out from the shadows. Sheriff Perkins, his face grim and tired from years of chasing men like the Campbells. He knew them. He knew their father. And now he knew that their time had come. John met his gaze without flinching. "You've come for us, Sheriff," he said quietly. "We knew it was coming." Perkins didn't speak right away. His eyes flickered to the rifles in the brothers' hands, then back to John. He had seen men in these mountains before, men who had fought for their land and their families. But this was different. The blood that had been spilled here wasn't just about moonshine. It was about something deeper, about a code of honor that, for better or worse, had shaped the Campbell family for generations. "I'm not here to start a fight, John," Perkins said, his voice soft, but filled with a weariness that only years of law enforcement could bring. "But you know what this means." "I know," John replied, "and I know what we've done. But we're not backing down. Not now." The lawmen spread out, surrounding the cabin, their rifles at the ready. The brothers stood their ground, facing the inevitability of what was to come. "We fight," John said one last time, the words heavy with finality. "This is our last stand." The law had come for them, and now the Campbell brothers would face the consequences of their choices, standing together to the very end.